In the vast, sprawling narrative of the United States, there are the stories we tell in the daylight. They are tales of revolution, of progress, of great men and grand ideals, the stories we chisel into monuments and print in textbooks. They are the scaffolding of a nation's identity. But alongside this official history, this bright and shining chronicle, runs another current. A darker, deeper, and far more unsettling river of narrative. A collection of stories whispered around campfires, murmured in darkened rooms, and passed down through generations like a secret hereditary tremor. These are the tales that live in the shadows, the folklore that gives the landscape its soul, its memories, and its ghosts. And among them all, one stands alone, an unholy mountain in the landscape of American legend. It is the chilling monolith of folklore, a story so uniquely well documented, so profoundly strange, and so deeply unnerving that it has resisted every attempt at simple explanation for more than 200 years. This is not a fleeting glimpse of a spectral figure in a window, nor a vague, misty legend with no names or dates. This is a story with a cast of real people, a specific time and place, a wealth of eyewitness testimony from the sober and the skeptical, and a narrative so bizarre, so cruel, and so relentless that it would be dismissed as overwrought fiction, were it not for the sheer, unyielding weight of the accounts. It is a story that features a pious, hard-working family, an invisible tormentor of terrifying intelligence and power, and, almost impossibly, a future president of the United States who would meet this entity and retreat in acknowledged defeat. This is not just another ghost story. For many folklorists, historians, and paranormal researchers, this is the foundational text of American supernatural horror, the country's most historically significant and forensically examined haunting. This is the detailed, authenticated, and utterly terrifying history of the Bell Witch. To truly understand this tale, to feel the genuine chill of it in our bones, we must first do more than just listen. We must transport ourselves. We must peel back the layers of modernity, the electricity, the science, the digital noise, and step into a different world, a different state of being. The year is 1804. The United States is a toddler of a nation young, raw, and seething with a restless, ambitious energy that is both its greatest strength and its most dangerous impulse. Thomas Jefferson sits in the president's house, and the ink is barely dry on the Louisiana Purchase, a single transaction that has doubled the nation's size and fired the imagination of thousands. The frontier is not a concept. It is a tangible, living, breathing thing. It is a siren call of cheap, fertile soil and the almost sacred chance to build a new life from nothing but faith, calloused hands, and unrelenting grit. It is a promise whispered on the east wind, a promise of ownership, autonomy, and a destiny of one's own making. But the frontier was a dual-faced god. For every promise of prosperity, there was a threat of peril. The land was rich, but it was also unforgiving. The forests were beautiful, but they were dark and deep, home to predators both animal and human. Sickness could wipe out a family in a week. A drought could wither a year's work into dust, and isolation was a constant, heavy presence. This was a world where the veil between civilization and chaos, between the known and the unknown, was perilously thin. It was a world steeped in a unique cocktail of devout, iron-willed Christianity, and a deep-seated, half-remembered reservoir of European folk superstitions. People read their Bibles by candlelight, believing in a God of order and providence, but they also knew the signs, the omens, the old ways of warding off bad luck, and the whispers of things that lurk just beyond the firelight. It was into this world that a man named John Bell, a farmer from Halifax County, North Carolina, decided to journey. John Bell was, by every conceivable measure, the archetype of the respectable American pioneer. Born in 1750, he had been a subject of the British Crown, had seen the birth of his new nation, and had embodied its most cherished values. He was a devout Christian, a respected deacon in the Red River Baptist Church, a man whose reputation for unwavering honesty in his dealings and soberness in his habits was unimpeachable. In an era and a place where a man's word and his good name were his most valuable assets, John Bell was considered wealthy in character long before he was wealthy in land. He was a husband to his wife, Lucy Williams Bell, herself a woman of fortitude and grace, and the patriarch of a growing family that looked to him for provision and protection. In the winter of 1804, he made the momentous decision to move. He gathered his family, packed his worldly possessions, tools, seeds, spinning wheels, and family Bibles into heavy wagons, and turned his face to the west. Their destination was a sprawling, untamed tract of land in the northern part of Tennessee, a newly settled area called Robertson County. There, along the verdant banks of the winding Red River, John Bell purchased 1,000 acres of rich, dark soil. The land was a sea of rolling hills, dense hardwood forests teeming with deer and turkey, and fertile bottomlands perfect for cultivating the cash crops of corn and tobacco. It was a place of immense beauty and immense, profound isolation. The nearest town of note was Port Royal, a small but bustling trading hub on the river. The community was a sparse patchwork of cabins and small farms carved out of the wilderness, where neighbors might be miles apart, yet were bound together by a shared struggle and a deep-seated need for fellowship and mutual protection. Here in this raw and promising land, the Bell family put down their roots. And for more than a decade they didn't just survive, they thrived. Their first home was a simple, sturdy 2-story log cabin, a testament to pioneer resilience, with a dog-trot breezeway connecting its 2 main sections. But as the years passed and their prosperity grew, this cabin was expanded and improved, becoming one of the largest and most comfortable homes in the entire region. Their fields yielded bountiful harvests year after year. Their livestock multiplied. Their family, which would eventually include 9 children, John Jr., Richard, Drury, Joel, Jesse, Benjamin, Esther, Elizabeth, and Zada, grew up strong, healthy, and well-regarded. John Bell became an elder at his church, a leadership position that cemented his status as a pillar of the community. His sons were known as hard workers, and his daughters as proper and pious. Their life was a testament to the American dream, a portrait of success earned through faith, hard labor, and unwavering determination. They were in every sense a blessed family. But in the late summer of the year 1817, that blessing began to curdle. A subtle, insidious darkness, like a creeping, unnatural fog, began to seep into the corners of their idyllic life. It started as a barely perceptible anomaly, a discordant note in the wholesome symphony of their ordered existence. This presence, whatever it was, would eventually tear their world apart, shatter their family to its core, and leave a permanent blood-red scar on the pages of American haunted history. It began, as these things so often do, with an incident that was both mundane and profoundly bizarre, a quiet moment of high strangeness on an otherwise ordinary day. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long finger-like shadows across his property, John Bell was walking through his cornfield. He was inspecting the ripening ears of corn, a familiar, satisfying ritual for a farmer at the end of a long day's work. As he moved between the tall, rustling stalks, his eye was caught by something that did not belong, something that violated the very laws of nature as he understood them. There, in the middle of a row, sat a creature of impossible biology. He would later describe it to his family with a farmer's plainness, a description that only made it more unsettling. It had the body of a large dog, but the head of a white rabbit. It sat there utterly still, watching him with an unnerving, placid intelligence. John Bell was a practical man, a man of the earth. He was not given to flights of fancy or prone to seeing apparitions. His world was one of soil, seasons, and scripture. This creature was an affront to that world, a glitch in the divine order he understood so well. Without a second thought, he did what any pioneer would do when faced with a strange, potentially dangerous animal on his property. He raised his heavy rifle to his shoulder, took careful aim at the unnatural beast, and fired. The crack of the shot echoed across the fields, sending a flock of birds scattering from the nearby woods. But the creature was not struck. It did not fall, nor did it cry out or run away. In the blink of an eye, in the space between the flash of gunpowder and the arrival of the lead ball, it simply vanished, utterly and completely. Bell, his heart pounding in his chest, walked to the spot. He searched the ground meticulously, parting the corn stalks, expecting to find some evidence of his encounter: a body, a splash of blood, at the very least a set of tracks in the soft, tilled earth. There was nothing. It was as if the creature had been a phantom, a projection, a trick of the fading light. Shaken but determined to find a rational explanation, he returned to his home. He resolved to keep the strange encounter to himself, not wanting to frighten his wife and children with a story he could barely believe himself. It was a mistake. He didn't know it then, but what he had seen in the cornfield was not an isolated event. It was an overture, and it was following him home. A few nights later, the disturbances began inside the house. They were subtle at first, small, innocuous sounds easily dismissed by a family accustomed to the nocturnal groans and sighs of a large log home. It began with a faint knocking, like a single knuckle rapping gently on the outside walls of the cabin, or on the front door. A member of the family would go to the door, peer out into the moonlit yard, but would find nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees and the sound of crickets. The nights were still, the woods silent. They reasoned it must be the wind rattling a loose board, a branch tapping against the wood, or perhaps a woodpecker settling in for the night. But the sounds grew more persistent, more specific and more personal. They began to emanate from inside the house. The family started to hear a faint scratching noise, like a mouse or a rat trapped within the walls, a common enough annoyance. But this soon escalated to a more vigorous and unsettling sound, the distinct noise of gnawing, as if a large rat were methodically and relentlessly chewing on the wooden bedposts in the children's rooms. The Bell sons, armed with lanterns and a pioneer's practicality, searched every inch of the house. They looked under beds, in closets, in the attic and the cellar. They set traps. They found no rats, no nests, no droppings, no evidence of any vermin whatsoever. Yet every night the gnawing sound would return, often seeming to move from one room to another as if it were intelligent, as if it were deliberately taunting them. Soon, the auditory phenomena expanded its repertoire. The family began to hear other, more human-like sounds that chilled them to the bone. The sound of faint whispers, so quiet they couldn't make out the words, seemed to emanate from the very air around them. It sounded, they would later say, like an old woman with no teeth, her lips smacking softly and wetly as she hummed a tuneless, mournful melody that hovered just on the very edge of hearing. The children, especially the Bells' youngest and most sensitive daughter, 12-year-old Elizabeth, known to everyone as Betsy, became increasingly terrified. Then came the first clear physical manifestations. The entity, whatever it was no longer content to just make noise. It wanted to touch. The children, and Betsy in particular, began to complain of having their bed covers violently ripped from them in the dead of night by an unseen force. Lucy Bell would tuck her children in tightly, only to be awoken hours later by their terrified screams. She would rush into their room to find them shivering in the cold, their heavy sheets and thick blankets lying in a heap on the floor, having been yanked off them with a strength that a child could not possibly fake. John Bell himself would try to hold the covers onto his children, only to feel them pulled from his grasp by an incredible, irresistible force. This was the first phase of the haunting, a period of creeping dread, escalating confusion, and carefully guarded secrecy. For nearly a full year, from the late summer of 1817 to the late summer of 1818, the Bell family endured these strange and frightening occurrences in absolute privacy. John Bell was a proud man, a church elder, a pillar of his community. The very last thing he wanted was for his family to be the subject of gossip, ridicule, or pity. He feared being labeled as eccentric or worse, as liars or frauds. He commanded his children, with all the authority of a stern patriarch, to say nothing of it to anyone outside the immediate family. They were to bear this strange, invisible burden in silence, praying with all their might that it would simply go away. But the entity, this invisible tormentor, would not allow for silence. It seemed to feed on their fear and their secrecy, and its power was growing exponentially. It was about to move from simply making noise and pulling blankets to actively, physically, and cruelly interacting with the family it had chosen as its own personal stage. As the months wore on, the physical assaults grew more frequent and alarmingly violent. The unseen force began to slap and pinch the children. Betsy Bell was unequivocally the primary target of this escalating physical abuse. She would cry out in the middle of the night, and her parents would rush in with a candle to find bright red welts, often in the perfect, unmistakable shape of a large handprint, blooming on her cheeks or arms. Her long hair would be pulled with such incredible force that she would scream in pain, sometimes finding it yanked from her scalp or tied into impossibly tight knots. She would complain of being stuck with invisible pins, of being pinched black and blue by a cruel, unseen hand. Other family members began to experience these attacks as well, but the focus, the epicenter of the physical malevolence, was always Betsy. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a coveted luxury the family could no longer afford. The nights became a gauntlet of terror, and the days were filled with bone-deep exhaustion and a gnawing dread of the coming sundown. The once happy, bustling home became a place of pervasive fear and anxiety. John Bell, a man of profound and unwavering faith, prayed constantly. He led his family in nightly scripture readings, his voice firm as he begged for deliverance from this evil. But his prayers seemed to have no effect. If anything, the entity only grew bolder, as if it were mocking his piety, as if it found his faith amusing. The faint whispers and humming had now evolved into something far more articulate and terrifying. The voice became clear, distinct, though often spoken in a choked, guttural and raspy tone. It would mimic the sounds of someone strangling, gasping for air. It would make the sound of a cat fighting with a dog, of rocks being thrown against the floorboards, of heavy iron chains being dragged across the attic floor above their heads. It was a cacophony of unsettling noises, a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare designed to fray every nerve and shatter the peace of the home. Finally, after more than a year of this escalating private torment, John Bell reached his breaking point. His pride, his stubbornness, his fear of public shame, it all collapsed under the unbearable weight of the terror his family was enduring. He could no longer watch his children, especially his beloved Betsy, suffer these nightly attacks. He had to seek help. He decided to confide in his closest and most trusted friend, a neighbor named James Johnston. He invited Johnston and his wife to spend the night at the Bell home, to witness the phenomena for themselves and to either confirm his sanity or expose a hidden, rational cause. That night, James Johnston, a man as practical and level-headed as John Bell, became a believer. As he and his wife sat with the exhausted Bell family in their dimly lit main room, the haunting began right on schedule. It started with the familiar knocking, then the scratching, then the horrifying sound of gnawing on the beds upstairs. Johnston and his wife listened, their faces pale in the flickering candlelight. Then came the inevitable screams from the children's room. They all rushed upstairs. Johnston watched in stunned, wide-eyed disbelief as the blankets were violently ripped from Betsy's bed by an invisible power. He himself, a strong man, tried to hold the blankets down, but they were pulled from his grasp with an astonishing, inhuman force. Johnston, a deeply religious man himself, tried to communicate with the entity. He spoke into the oppressive darkness of the room, his voice trembling slightly, asking it in the name of the Holy Trinity what it was and what it wanted. The response was a series of guttural hisses and choked noises, and then an unnerving, heavy silence. But Johnston had seen and heard more than enough. He turned to his friend John Bell, his face grim, and confirmed his worst fears. This was no trick. This was not the wind. This was not a figment of their exhausted imaginations. This was something real, something powerful, and something profoundly malevolent. The secret was out. The dam of the Bells' silence had broken, and now the story flowed out into the community. James Johnston, now utterly convinced of the haunting's authenticity, insisted that this was no longer a private matter for the Bells to bear alone. It was a matter for the entire community. He suggested forming an informal investigation committee, composed of trusted neighbors and fellow church members. A small group of men from the area, led by Johnston, began to spend nights at the Bell House, hoping to find a rational explanation or, failing that, to document and communicate with the spirit. This is a crucial, pivotal turning point in the story of the Bell Witch. It moves from a private family trauma to a public, documented event. The witnesses were not strangers passing through. They were the most respected members of the local community, church elders, landowners, sober-minded farmers, and their wives. Their collective testimony, given over a period of years, lends a weight and a credibility to this story that most ghost tales and local legends utterly lack. The presence, which was now being referred to as the spirit or the entity, seemed to absolutely revel in the newfound attention. With a larger audience, its powers seemed to blossom, to grow more refined and more spectacular. It began to speak more clearly, its voice growing stronger, more articulate, and more shockingly conversational with each passing week. And what it had to say was nothing short of astonishing. It demonstrated a shocking, inexplicable, and terrifying level of omniscience. It knew the deepest, most private secrets of every single visitor who dared to spend a night in that house. It would greet newcomers by name, even if they had been brought in secretly and had never been introduced. It would then proceed to recount, with gleeful and malicious accuracy, embarrassing or secret events from their past youthful indiscretions, private family quarrels, secret business dealings, hidden sins, things that no one outside of their own families, and sometimes not even them, could possibly have known. One man was reminded of a horse he had stolen as a boy. Another was asked about a private, whispered argument he'd had with his wife just that morning in the privacy of their own home miles away. The entity's intelligence was as terrifying as its physical power. Its abilities bordered on the miraculous. On one famous occasion it quoted, word for word and in perfect sequence, 2 different sermons that had been preached at the exact same time on the same Sunday morning at 2 different churches. One at the Red River Baptist Church where the Bells were members, and the other at a church in the distant settlement of Port Royal, miles away. The entity recited both sermons flawlessly, much to the astonishment of members of both congregations who were present in the Bell home. The community was both mesmerized and horrified. The Bell farm ceased to be just a home. It became a local, and then a regional phenomenon. It was a living crucible of the supernatural. People began to travel from miles around, from across Tennessee and into neighboring Kentucky, their curiosity overriding their fear, all hoping to witness the strange events for themselves. The Bell home was constantly filled with visitors, turning the family's private nightmare into a bizarre, ongoing public spectacle. And the entity, which now had a captive and ever-growing audience, finally decided to give itself a name and a motivation. During one of these nightly vigils, a visitor, emboldened by the spirit's talkative nature, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Who are you? In the name of God, what is your name?" After a moment of dramatic silence, the raspy metallic voice gave a chilling and specific answer. It claimed to be the spirit of Kate Batts, a cantankerous and eccentric old neighbor of the Bells. John Bell had had a minor, and by all accounts amicably resolved, business dispute with the Batts family years earlier over the purchase of some land. The entity, speaking in its disembodied voice, now claimed that John Bell had cheated her in that deal. It wasn't her ghost, it clarified with a strange precision, but her witch, her familiar spirit, her projected malice, that had come to exact a terrible and long-simmering revenge. From that moment on, the entity was known to all as Kate, or more famously and more fearfully, the Bell Witch. Now, it is a crucial and deeply bizarre footnote in this story that the real Kate Batts was, at this time, still very much alive. She was an elderly woman who lived nearby and was widely considered by her neighbors to be peculiar, sharp-tongued, and perhaps a little unpleasant, but there was no widespread, serious belief that she was a practicing witch in any malevolent sense. The spirit, however, was adamant. It was Kate Batts's witch. And as it grew more talkative and confident, it laid out its intentions with a terrifying and unwavering clarity. It had two primary stated goals. First, and most importantly, it wanted to kill John Bell. It referred to him constantly and contemptuously as Old Jack Bell or Old Jack. And it tormented him without mercy, promising over and over again, in front of dozens of witnesses, that it would harass him to his grave and beyond. Second, it was absolutely determined to prevent Betsy Bell from marrying a young man she had begun courting, a respectable local named Joshua Gardner, of whom she was very fond. The spirit seemed to have a particular, almost obsessive and cruelly intimate fixation on Betsy, yet it also seemed strangely protective of her, stating repeatedly that Joshua Gardner was not the right man for her, and that their union must not be allowed to happen for her own good. The torment of John Bell now became the central, horrifying drama of the haunting. While the entire family suffered, and visitors were often spooked or embarrassed, the Bell Witch reserved a special, relentless, and sadistic cruelty for the patriarch of the family. His health, once robust, began to fail dramatically under the constant psychological stress and direct physical attacks. He began to suffer from a mysterious and terrifying affliction of the throat and mouth. His tongue would suddenly swell to an enormous size without warning, making it impossible for him to speak, to eat, or even to swallow. He experienced debilitating seizures that would leave him weak, disoriented, and bruised. His face became locked in frequent, painful contortions. During these agonizing episodes, the witch would cackle and shriek with glee, its disembodied voice filling the house, mocking him as he writhed in pain. It would slap him across the face with enough force to knock him from his chair, pull his hair, and scream obscenities directly into his ear. The respected, strong pioneer farmer was being systematically dismantled body and soul, reduced to a shell of his former self, a man living in constant abject fear in the very home he had built. The fame of the Bell Witch haunting continued to spread like wildfire, carried by travelers and traders along the river routes and wilderness roads. It became a topic of conversation in parlors and taverns across the young nation. And this is where the story takes its most famous, its most incredible, and its most historically significant turn, intersecting with one of the most powerful and formidable figures in all of American history. By the year 1819, the tale of the inexplicable goings-on at the Bell Farm had reached the city of Nashville and the ears of a man who was already a living legend, General Andrew Jackson. Jackson, the undisputed hero of the Battle of New Orleans, the vanquisher of the British, the Indian fighter, and a future president of the United States, was a man carved from granite and gunpowder. He was known for his iron will, his explosive temper, and his profound, almost aggressive skepticism. He was not a man to believe in spooks, spirits, or backwoods fairy tales. Intrigued, and perhaps more than a little amused by the sensational stories, he decided to form a small expedition and go see this famous Bell Witch for himself. He gathered a group of his men, a retinue of tough, hardened veterans accustomed to following their general into any fray. Among them was a man who was reportedly a professional witch tamer, an exorcist of sorts who claimed he had special knowledge, tools, and abilities to deal with supernatural entities. He was boastful and confident, and Jackson brought him along, perhaps for sport, to see the man either succeed or be humiliated. They loaded a heavy wagon with supplies, tents, and provisions and set off on horseback from Nashville for the Bell Farm in what was then Robertson County, a journey of some 50 miles. According to the historical account, an account which Jackson and his men would recount with deadly seriousness for the rest of their lives, the strange events began before the party even reached the boundary of the Bell property. As their entourage neared the farm, their heavy supply wagon, drawn by a team of strong horses, suddenly and inexplicably ground to a complete halt. The horses strained against their harnesses, their powerful muscles bunching, but the wagon would not budge an inch. It was as if it were chained to the very bedrock of the earth. The men, soldiers accustomed to solving practical problems with brute force, got down and put their shoulders to the wheels, pushing with all their might. They whipped the horses until their hides were flecked with foam. They meticulously checked the wheels for any obstruction, a rock, a root, a broken axle. They found nothing. The road was clear, the wheels were sound, yet the wagon was frozen in place, utterly and infuriatingly immovable. After a considerable and increasingly frustrating struggle, an exasperated Andrew Jackson, a man not known for his patience, is said to have thrown up his hands and exclaimed, his voice ringing with frustration, "By the eternal boys, it's the witch!" No sooner had he spoken these words, acknowledging the entity's power, than a sharp, clear, metallic-sounding female voice echoed from the empty air around them, seeming to come from the dense foliage of the nearby woods. The voice laughed, a mocking, triumphant and chilling sound. "All right, General," the voice declared, loud enough for all to hear. "Let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." And just like that, the invisible force that had been holding the wagon was released. The horses, with a simple command, moved forward with ease, pulling the now weightless-seeming wagon behind them. The party of hardened soldiers, now thoroughly unnerved and their easy skepticism shattered, proceeded in a heavy, uneasy silence to the Bell farm. Jackson and his men were greeted by a weary John Bell, and made their camp near the family cabin. The witch-tamer and his group, however, remained arrogant and undeterred. He proudly displayed his tools of the trade, loading his pistol with a specially made silver bullet and bragging to anyone who would listen about how he would swiftly deal with this so-called spirit. He claimed to possess a secret ritual, a powerful incantation that would either silence the entity for good or force it to reveal itself in a physical form that he could then banish with his witch ball. As the men settled in for the night, huddled around their campfires, the Bell Witch made its presence known. And it went straight for the braggart. It started with its usual repertoire of whispers and taunts directed at the witch-tamer, calling him a fraud and a fool. Then it escalated to direct and violent physical assault. The man was slapped, pinched, and had his hair pulled by his invisible assailant. He was lifted from the ground and thrown about his tent like a rag doll. He screamed that he was being stuck with hundreds of pins and beaten with invisible sticks. Then the witch began to speak to him directly, mocking him unmercifully and, in front of all of Jackson's other men who listened in horrified silence, revealing his most private and shameful secrets, his vanities, his fears, and his failures. The man was utterly humiliated and broken with raw terror. After a relentless barrage of physical and psychological torment that lasted for what felt like an eternity, the witch-tamer finally snapped. Screaming in pure primal fear, he burst from his tent and fled the encampment, running blindly into the darkness of the Tennessee night. The Bell Witch, according to the legend, pursued him for miles, its mocking laughter and terrifying shrieks following him all the way back towards Nashville. Andrew Jackson, the man who had faced down the disciplined redcoats of the British Army without flinching, was profoundly shaken by what he and his men had witnessed. The power, the intelligence, and the sheer malevolence of the entity were undeniable and terrifying. The following morning, Jackson reportedly met with his host, John Bell, and made a statement that would become legendary. A quote that encapsulates the entire bizarre encounter. "I would rather fight the entire British Army than have to deal with the Bell Witch." He and his men wanted no more of it. They wasted no time. They packed up their camp and left immediately. returning to Nashville and taking with them a story that would forever link the future 7th President of the United States to America's most infamous haunting. The Belle Witch had faced down and soundly defeated one of the nation's most formidable heroes. With Jackson and his retinue gone, the witch refocused its full malevolent attention on the besieged Bell family, and specifically on its two declared missions: preventing Betsy's marriage and killing John Bell. The campaign against Betsy and her beloved suitor, Joshua Gardner, became a relentless war of psychological attrition. Whenever the young man would visit the Bell home to court Betsy, the witch would scream vile, unspeakable obscenities at them. It would mimic their private conversations, twisting their words of affection into cruel mockeries. It would physically assault them, pinching them, slapping them, and throwing objects at them from across the room. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The disembodied voice followed them everywhere on the property, a constant, hateful third presence in their relationship, never allowing them a single moment of peace or privacy. It was a supernatural chaperone from hell. The emotional toll on the young couple was devastating. How could a romance blossom under such a constant, supernatural siege? How could a life be built on such haunted ground? Eventually, worn down, heartbroken, and seeing no possible future under such conditions, Betsy Bell made a decision that shattered her own heart. On Easter Monday of 1821, she tearfully broke off her engagement to Joshua Gardner. The Bell Witch had achieved its first major victory, and it celebrated. For days after the breakup, the house was filled with the sound of the witch singing loud, triumphant, and often vulgar songs, its joyful maniacal cackling echoing through the rooms where the family sat in stunned silent misery. Now, only one task remained on its grim self-appointed agenda. The health of John Bell Sr. continued its steep and terrifying decline. By the autumn of 1820, he was almost entirely bedridden, a frail prisoner in his own home. He was racked by the mysterious seizures and the agonizing affliction of his mouth and throat. His face was often contorted by violent, uncontrollable twitching, and he could barely speak or swallow. The witch's taunts were now constant and brutal. It would loudly proclaim to the family and any visitors that it was the one causing his suffering, that it was doctoring old Jack, and that it would not be long before it finished the job for good. The family could do nothing but watch, helpless and heartbroken, as their patriarch, their strong and steady father, wasted away into a shadow before their very eyes. On the morning of December 19, 1820, the end came. John Bell did not wake up as usual. He was found in his bed, breathing shallowly, in a deep, unnatural stupor from which he could not be roused. The family was thrown into a panic. His son, John Jr., rushed to the medicine cupboard to retrieve his father's usual medication. There on the shelf he found something that did not belong. A strange small vial filled with a dark, smoky-colored, unfamiliar liquid. It had not been there the day before. No one in the family had purchased it, and no doctor had prescribed it. It had simply appeared. A deep and terrible suspicion fell over the family. They immediately sent for the doctor, Dr. George Hobson. When the doctor arrived and examined the strange vial, he was as baffled as they were. The family, led by John Jr., decided to conduct a horrifying but necessary experiment. They took the vial and, using a straw, administered a single drop of the mysterious liquid to the family cat. The cat, which had been perfectly healthy just moments before, immediately went into violent convulsions and died almost instantly. At that exact moment, the triumphant, horrifying voice of the Bell Witch filled the room, its tones dripping with malicious, victorious glee. It shrieked, loud enough for all to hear, "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, and that has fixed him." The voice then went on to taunt them, saying that he would not wake again from his stupor. John Bell Sr. died the following day, on December 20, 1820. The official cause of death was never determined by the doctors of the time, who were baffled by his long, strange illness. But for the Bell family, for James Johnston, and for the entire community that had witnessed the events of the past 3 years, there was no doubt whatsoever. John Bell had been tormented, tortured, and finally poisoned by the invisible entity that had invaded his home. It is for this reason that the Bell Witch haunting is often cited as the only case in American history where a death has been officially attributed, by the family and the community, to the direct actions of a supernatural entity. The entity's cruelty did not end with his death. During John Bell's funeral, as friends and family gathered around his gravesite to pay their last respects to the once respected man, the Bell Witch was not silent. Mourners were subjected to the ghastly, surreal sound of the witch singing bawdy, drunken songs, its loud voice ringing out over the solemn prayers of the minister. It was a final macabre act of disrespect, a grotesque celebration of its ultimate victory over old Jack Bell. After the death of John Bell and the breaking of Betsy's engagement, the activity of the Bell Witch began to subside dramatically. It had, it seemed, achieved everything it set out to do. Its missions were complete. It still spoke to the family on occasion, particularly to Lucy Bell, to whom it now showed a strange, almost gentle kindness, offering her comfort and advice. But its interactions were far less violent and much less frequent. Several weeks after the funeral, it gathered the remaining family members in a sense by speaking to them all at once. It announced that it would be leaving them in peace. But it made a chilling promise. It would return in 7 years, in the year 1828. And with that, the house on the Red River fell silent. Peace at long last returned to the Bell farm. For 7 years, life for the shattered Bell family returned to a semblance of normalcy. They tried to rebuild their lives from the ashes of the trauma they had endured. Lucy Bell never remarried and continued to run the farm with her sons. Betsy Bell, finally free from the witch's curse, eventually married another man, Richard Powell, the local schoolteacher who had been a frequent visitor during the haunting in 1824. They moved away from the haunted farm. The other children grew up, married, and started families of their own. The story of the haunting became a dark and terrible memory, a chapter they hoped was closed forever. But the entity was true to its word. In 1828 it returned. This time, however, its nature and its focus seemed entirely different. The focus of its attention was not the entire family, but specifically John Bell Jr., the eldest son. The haunting was much shorter and far less violent than the first. It consisted mostly of long, complex, and deeply philosophical conversations. The witch, as they still called it, engaged John Jr. in profound theological and metaphysical discussions. It spoke of the creation of the world, the nature of good and evil, the purpose of humanity, and the mysteries of the cosmos. It also, according to John Jr.'s later accounts as recorded by Martin Ingram, made a series of startlingly accurate prophecies about the future. It is said to have predicted the American Civil War with stunning precision, the division of the nation, the bloody battles that would be fought on Tennessee soil, and the eventual emancipation of the slaves. It also allegedly foretold the coming of the 2 world wars and the Great Depression. After a few weeks of these strange and prophetic visitations, the witch announced it was leaving again, this time for a much longer period. It made one final haunting promise. It would return one last time in 107 years, to one of John Bell's direct descendants. That promised return would have been in the year 1935. There is no official record or credible family account of any such return. After its brief, talkative, and prophetic visit in 1828, the Bell Witch vanished seemingly for good, fading from an active, tormenting entity into the realm of pure, terrifying American legend. So what on God's green earth are we to make of this incredible, detailed, and deeply disturbing story? This is the point where we must step back from the immersive narrative and put on the hats of the historian, the psychologist, the folklorist, and the skeptic. What really happened in that small log cabin in Tennessee 2 centuries ago? The theories are as fascinating, as complex, and as varied as the haunting itself. Let's begin with the first and most straightforward explanation, that the story is true exactly as it was told, that an incorporeal, intelligent, and malevolent entity, be it a demon, a damned soul, a nature spirit of the land, or the vengeful witch of Cape Bats, did, in fact, invade the Bell home and systematically terrorize the family. The primary evidence for this rests on the sheer volume and quality of the witness testimony. This wasn't just the word of a single, isolated, frightened family. It was their friends, their neighbors, local clergy, doctors, and scores of visitors from across the region, including most famously and most credibly General Andrew Jackson and his men. The entity's reported abilities: its physical power to slap, scratch, and throw objects, its omniscience regarding personal secrets, its ability to be in multiple places at once and to project its voice over great distances, its capacity to predict future events, are all classic hallmarks of a powerful poltergeist or demonic entity. Proponents of the supernatural explanation argue that no single hoax, and no known psychological condition, could possibly account for the full range of phenomena, sustained over 3 years, under the intense scrutiny of so many varied and independent witnesses. But, of course, for every supernatural claim there must be a rational skeptical inquiry. And the skeptical explanations for the Bell Witch are powerful and compelling in their own right. The most prominent skeptical theory, and the one most often cited, is that the entire affair was a long, elaborate, and brilliantly executed hoax. But if it was a hoax, who was the perpetrator? This question leads us to the very source of the story itself. As we've noted, much of what we know comes from the 1894 book by journalist Martin Van Buren Ingram, An Authenticated History of the Bell Witch. Ingram claimed his book was based almost entirely on a diary and detailed notes kept throughout the haunting by Richard Williams Bell, one of John Bell's sons. This diary, however, has never been seen by any other historian. The original manuscript, according to Ingram, was passed down through the family and then given to him, but it has since been conveniently lost to history. This is a massive red flag for any historian. Without the primary source document, we are forced to take Ingram's word for it. It's entirely possible that Ingram, a 19th-century journalist writing for a public hungry for sensational tales, embellished, exaggerated, or even fabricated parts of the story to make it more dramatic. The prophecy of the Civil War, for instance, is easy to predict in 1894, after it has already happened. However, even if Ingram's book is not 100% factual, the core stories of the Bell Witch existed in the oral tradition of Tennessee for decades before his book was published. The Andrew Jackson connection, for example, was a well-known piece of local lore long before Ingram put pen to paper. So if it was a hoax, it had to have started with someone at the scene back in 1817. The most popular candidate for the role of hoaxer is a man we have already met: Richard Powell. Powell was the local schoolteacher, a man known for his intelligence, his education, and perhaps his cunning. He was also the man who was deeply in love with Betsy Bell, and who conveniently married her after the witch's torment successfully drove away his rival, Joshua Gardner. The theory goes that Powell, a master of ventriloquism and various acoustic tricks, orchestrated the entire haunting to achieve his personal goal. A skilled ventriloquist could have produced the strange, disembodied voices that were often described as hard to place. As the schoolteacher, he would have been a natural clearinghouse for local gossip, which he could have used to create the stunning illusion of omniscience, revealing secrets that he had simply overheard from his students or their parents. The motive is crystal clear: scare off Joshua Gardner and win Betsy's hand. The death of John Bell, who perhaps disapproved of Powell, could have been a tragic coincidence of a real, but mysterious illness that Powell simply took credit for through his witch persona to cement the legend and remove the final obstacle. Once his goals were achieved, the witch conveniently went away. It's a neat, tidy theory that provides a rational motive and a plausible method. The primary arguments against the Richard Powell theory, however, are significant. Could ventriloquism and simple tricks really account for the incredible physical phenomena reported by dozens of people? Could a schoolteacher's prank account for the violent slaps and pinches that left physical visible marks on Betsy? Could it account for the powerful unseen force that allegedly stopped Andrew Jackson's heavy wagon dead in its tracks? For many, the reported power of the entity far exceeds the capabilities of a single human hoaxer. This leads us to another, more modern and psychologically nuanced theory. This theory removes the element of conscious deception and instead centers on Betsy Bell herself. In the early 19th century, the human mind was a black box. Conditions we now understand, like dissociative disorders, conversion disorders, and the profound effects of trauma, were completely unknown and would have been interpreted through a lens of religion and superstition. It is possible that Betsy, a young girl on the turbulent cusp of adolescence, was the unconscious epicenter of the poltergeist activity. In the field of parapsychology, it's a common theory that poltergeist phenomena are not caused by spirits of the dead, but are rather a form of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, RSPK, the ability of the mind to influence the physical world emanating from a living person, usually an adolescent under extreme emotional, sexual, or psychological stress. Consider the evidence from this perspective. Betsy was the primary target of the witch's physical abuse. The witch was obsessed with her romantic life, controlling her choices with an iron fist. Could this entire terrifying saga have been an externalized manifestation of her own internal turmoil? Perhaps it was a subconscious rebellion against the oppressive patriarchal structure of the time, or a deep-seated fear of marriage and sexuality. The voice of the witch could have been a form of dissociative vocalization, a second personality born of trauma. Her father, John Bell, was also a primary target. A darker, more speculative modern interpretation suggests the possibility of abuse within the family, with the witch being a psychic defense mechanism created by Betsy to fight back against her abuser. The entity's two goals: stop her marriage and kill her father, take on a chilling new significance in this light. This theory places the source of the haunting squarely within the Bell family, but it reframes the story. It is no longer a tale of supernatural evil, but a deeply tragic story of a young girl's powerful, misunderstood psychological crisis that erupted with terrifying physical force. Finally, we must consider the possibility that it was not one single thing, but a perfect storm, a confluence of multiple factors. Perhaps it began with a few strange natural occurrences: the nocturnal sounds of a log house settling, the eerie cry of a screech owl, an unusual animal sighting. In a deeply religious and superstitious community, these small anomalies could have planted a seed of fear. This fear, amplified by family tensions and the power of suggestion, could have spiraled into a case of collective delusion or mass hysteria. Then perhaps a clever and opportunistic individual like Richard Powell saw a chance to exploit the existing fear to achieve his own ends, adding his own manufactured phenomena into the mix. In this view, the Bell Witch haunting is a complex tapestry woven from threads of real natural events, profound psychological stress, powerful communal belief, and possible human deception, all of which was later stitched together and embellished by a sensationalist writer. The truth, in all likelihood, is something we will never definitively know. The mists of 2 centuries have obscured the hard facts. The key players are long gone, their secrets buried with them in the Tennessee soil. The crucial primary source, Richard Bell's diary, is lost forever. All we are left with is the story. And what a story it is! The tale of the Bell Witch has had a profound and lasting impact on American culture and on the horror genre worldwide. It is the archetype, the blueprint for countless haunted house stories that have followed. The idea of an ordinary family tormented in their own home, of a spirit with a clear name and a vindictive motive, of physical assaults from an invisible foe, of a specific person being the focus of the haunting. These are tropes that the Bell Witch haunting codified for the American imagination. Its influence can be seen in books and films from The Exorcist to the Amityville Horror and Poltergeist. It is the direct spiritual ancestor of the found-footage horror classic The Blair Witch Project, which brilliantly borrowed the concept of a named, unseen witch in the woods and the premise of a documented real-life horror. Today, the town of Adams, Tennessee, still lives in the long dark shadow of its most famous and feared resident. The legend is not a dusty piece of history. It is a vibrant, living part of the local culture and economy. You can visit the Bell Witch Cave, a nearby cave on what was once the Bell property, a place where the spirit was said to sometimes reside to escape the family's prayers. You can tour a replica of the Bell Cabin. The story is kept alive, a chilling piece of haunted history that refuses to die. So why? Why does this 200-year-old piece of American folklore continue to hold such a powerful and enduring grip on our collective imagination? Perhaps it's because it touches upon so many of our most primal and deeply seated fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the dark, the terrifying notion that our homes, our sanctuaries, are not the safe havens we believe them to be, and the ultimate fear that we are not alone in this universe, that there are forces and consciousnesses in the world far beyond our control and our comprehension. The Bell Witch story is more than just a ghost tale. It's a dark mirror held up to the American frontier experience. It speaks to the deep anxieties of a people living on the very edge of a vast, untamed wilderness, a place where the line between the natural world and the supernatural world was perilously thin and easily crossed. It's a story about the darkness that can lurk behind a facade of piety and respectability, a story about family secrets, hidden guilt, and the terrifying possibility that the past is never truly dead and buried, and that sometimes it comes back for revenge. Whether it was a genuine poltergeist that defied the laws of physics, a complex and cruel hoax perpetrated for love and control, a tragic psychological breakdown of a young woman that manifested with terrifying power, or a powerful mass delusion that gripped an entire community, the Bell Witch haunting remains one of the most compelling, frightening, and endlessly fascinating mysteries in all of American history. It stands as a grim and chilling testament to a time when the world was a little wilder, the nights a little darker, and the whispers in the dark felt terrifyingly mortally real. It is a story that has been told and retold for generations, a piece of foundational American dread, and one that will likely continue to be told as long as we are drawn to the shadows, huddled together against the cold, asking the eternal question, what is truly out there in the dark? The most popular candidate for the role of hoaxer is a man we have already met, Richard Powell. Powell was the local schoolteacher, a man known for his intelligence and education, a rare commodity on the frontier. He was also the man who was deeply in love with Betsy Bell, and who conveniently married her after the witch's torment successfully drove away his rival, Joshua Gardner. The theory goes that Powell, a master of ventriloquism and acoustic tricks, orchestrated the entire haunting to achieve his personal goal. A skilled ventriloquist could have produced the strange, disembodied voices that were often described as hard to place. As the schoolteacher, he would have been a natural clearinghouse for local gossip, which he could have used to create the stunning illusion of omniscience, revealing secrets that he had simply overheard. The motive is clear: scare off Joshua Gardner and win Betsy's hand. The death of John Bell, who perhaps disapproved of Powell, could have been a tragic coincidence of illness that Powell simply took credit for through his witch persona to cement the legend. Once his goals were achieved, the witch conveniently went away. It's a neat, tidy theory that provides a rational motive and a plausible method. The primary arguments against the Richard Powell theory, however, are significant. Could ventriloquism and simple tricks really account for the incredible physical phenomena reported by dozens of people? Could a schoolteacher's prank account for the violent slaps and pinches that left physical marks on Betsy? Could it account for the powerful unseen force that allegedly stopped Andrew Jackson's heavy wagon dead in its tracks? For many, the reported power of the entity far exceeds the capabilities of a single human hoaxer. This leads us to another, more modern and psychologically nuanced theory. This theory removes the element of conscious deception and instead centers on Betsy Bell herself. In the early 19th century, the human mind was a black box. Conditions we now understand, like dissociative disorders, hysteria, and the effects of trauma, were completely unknown and would have been interpreted through a lens of religion and superstition. It is possible that Betsy, a young girl on the turbulent cusp of adolescence, was the unconscious epicenter of the poltergeist activity. In the field of parapsychology, it's a common theory that poltergeist phenomena are not caused by spirits of the dead, but are rather a form of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, the ability of the mind to influence the physical world emanating from a living person, usually an adolescent under extreme emotional, sexual, or psychological stress. Consider the evidence. Betsy was the primary target of the witch's physical abuse. The witch was obsessed with her romantic life, controlling her choices with an iron fist. Could this entire terrifying saga have been an externalized manifestation of her own internal turmoil? Perhaps it was a subconscious rebellion against the oppressive patriarchal structure of the time, or a deep-seated fear of marriage and sexuality. The voice of the witch could have been a form of dissociative vocalization, a second personality born of trauma. The physical phenomena could have been the result of her own latent, uncontrolled psychic energy lashing out at the world. This theory places the source of the haunting squarely within the Bell family, but it reframes the story. It is no longer a tale of supernatural evil, but a deeply tragic story of a young girl's powerful, misunderstood psychological crisis. We must also consider the possibility that it was not one single thing, but a perfect storm, a confluence of multiple factors. Perhaps it began with a few strange natural occurrences, the nocturnal sounds of a log house settling, the eerie cry of a screech owl, an unusual animal sighting. In a deeply religious and superstitious community, these small anomalies could have planted a seed of fear. This fear, amplified by family tensions and the power of suggestion, could have spiraled into a case of collective delusion or mass hysteria. Then perhaps a clever and opportunistic individual like Richard Powell saw a chance to exploit the existing fear to achieve his own ends, adding his own manufactured phenomena into the mix. In this view, the Bell Witch haunting is a complex tapestry woven from threads of natural events, psychological stress, communal belief, and possible human deception. The truth, in all likelihood, is something we will never definitively know. The mists of 2 centuries have obscured the hard facts. The key players are long gone, their secrets buried with them. The crucial primary source, Richard Bell's diary, is lost. All we are left with is the story. And what a story it is! The tale of the Bell Witch has had a profound and lasting impact on American culture and on the horror genre worldwide. It is the archetype, the blueprint for countless haunted house stories that have followed. The idea of an ordinary family tormented in their own home, of a spirit with a clear name and a vindictive motive, of physical assaults from an invisible foe, of a specific person being the focus of the haunting. These are tropes that the Bell Witch haunting codified for the American imagination. Its influence can be seen in books and films from The Exorcist to the Amityville Horror and Poltergeist. It is the direct spiritual ancestor of the found-footage horror classic The Blair Witch Project, which brilliantly borrowed the concept of a named, unseen witch in the woods and the premise of a documented real-life horror. Today, the town of Adams, Tennessee, still lives in the long shadow of its most famous and feared resident. The legend is not a dusty piece of history. It is a vibrant, living part of the local culture and economy. You can visit the Bell Witch Cave, a nearby cave on what was once the Bell property, a place where the spirit was said to sometimes reside to escape the family's prayers. You can tour a replica of the Bell Cabin. The story is kept alive, a chilling piece of haunted history that refuses to die. So why does this 200-year-old piece of American folklore continue to hold such a powerful and enduring grip on our collective imagination? Perhaps it's because it touches upon so many of our most primal and deeply seated fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of the dark, the terrifying notion that our homes are not the safe havens we believe them to be. and the ultimate fear that we are not alone, that there are forces in the world far beyond our control and comprehension. The Bell Witch story is more than just a ghost tale. It's a dark mirror held up to the American frontier experience. It speaks to the deep anxieties of a people living on the very edge of a vast, untamed wilderness, a place where the line between the natural world and the supernatural world was perilously thin and easily crossed. It's a story about the darkness that can lurk behind a facade of piety and respectability, a story about family secrets, hidden guilt, and the terrifying possibility that the past is never truly dead and buried. Whether it was a genuine poltergeist that defied the laws of physics, a complex and cruel hoax perpetrated for love, a tragic psychological breakdown of a young woman, or a powerful mass delusion that gripped an entire community, the Bell Witch haunting remains one of the most compelling, frightening, and endlessly fascinating mysteries in all of American history. It stands as a grim and chilling testament to a time when the world was a little wilder, the nights a little darker, and the whispers in the dark felt terrifyingly mortally real. It is a story that has been told and retold for generations, a piece of foundational American dread, and one that will likely continue to be told as long as we are drawn to the shadows, huddled together against the cold, asking the eternal question, what is truly out there in the dark? Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive into one of America's most enduring and profoundly frightening legends. The questions surrounding the Bell family and the intelligent, malevolent entity that tormented them are as alive and as haunting today as they were 2 centuries ago. What do you believe truly happened on that remote Tennessee farm? Was it the vengeful spirit of Kate Batts? A brilliant sociopathic hoax? A young girl's psychic trauma made manifest? Or something else entirely, something for which we still have no name? We would love to hear your theories, your interpretations, and your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this exploration of haunted history and American folklore compelling, please consider liking this presentation and subscribing to our channel for more journeys into the strange, forgotten, and mysterious corners of our shared past. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep investigation. Until next time, be well, and perhaps try not to listen too closely to the strange knocks and whispers your own house makes in the dead of night. You never know who or what might be listening back.